Hello everyone, bonjour tout le monde and welcome to Concordia University's Fourth Space. Thank you for joining us for today's panel conversation centered around decarbonizing Canadian buildings, whereby we'll explore the current state of decarbonization efforts in Canada's building sector and the challenges that must be overcome in order to meet the country's emissions reduction targets. Very quickly, to help situate you, you're joining us online or in person from Fourth Space. We are streaming this panel conversation live to YouTube from Fourth Space, which is located on unceded Indigenous lands here in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. As caretakers for the lands and waters that we're meeting on, we'd like to extend our gratitude to the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation for their teachings about the earth and our relations. If you're unfamiliar with this space that you've just walked into, online or in person, what we do here is work with our university community to mobilize and exchange knowledge by co-creating daily activities. And we have the pleasure of working with Concordia University public scholars as well. So to that end, today we're so happy to welcome in your moderator and doctoral candidate in building engineering, Mustafa Saad, into the space. And thank you, Mustafa, for bringing together this great panel of experts who will be introduced shortly. Just a quick word about engagement. If you're joining us in person, we hope to have time to take some audience questions. So feel free to jump in with a raised hand and we'll get this microphone to you so that the folks on Zoom can hear you. And if you're on Zoom, you're more than welcome to raise a virtual hand and jump in during the Q&A by speaking. Otherwise, of course, the chat space is activated for you as well. That's it for me. Over to you, Mustafa. Welcome.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to this panel discussion on decarbonizing Canadian buildings, obstacles and opportunities. Basically, I'm Mustafa, a doctoral researcher at the Gina Cody School for Engineering and a public scholar of Concordia University for this year. And I'm very happy today to be the moderator for this topic. So mainly I will start by a thesis to introduce the topic. As I've mentioned, we will be talking today about decarbonizing Canadian buildings and the obstacles and opportunities that lie ahead in this topic. As we are all aware, the issue of climate change is one of the most pressing challenges facing our world today. It's a global problem that requires global solutions, and the building sector has a significant role to play in reducing carbon emissions and contributing to a more sustainable future. Canada, as a developed country, has a responsibility to lead the way in reducing its carbon footprint. The building sector is responsible for a large portion of the country's emissions, and it's imperative that we take action to decarbonize our buildings. You might not know it, but buildings we live, work, and play in are actually responsible for a large portion of the carbon emissions that we release yearly. In fact, actually in 2019, the building sector accounted for 12% of the country's total greenhouse gas emissions. That's on like the country scale, but if we go to municipalities, it's much higher than that. That's why it's so important that we take action to decarbonize our buildings. But it's not just up to government to make this happen. We all have roles to play here. That's why it's so important that we work together, industry, government, academia, and you and me actually. So, however, this is no easy task and there are many obstacles to overcome if we are to achieve our goals, such as cost, technical gaps, or time. But as with any challenge, there's also a lot of opportunities that lie ahead. In this panel discussion, we will explore the obstacles and opportunities associated with decarbonizing Canadian buildings. Our expert panelists will share their insights and experiences on this critical issue, and we will discuss what needs to be done to overcome the obstacles and seize the opportunities. So our guests on this panel each bring their unique background experiences on the discussion regarding decarbonizing Canadian buildings. We have four of very notable experts in the field, starting from Ursula Eicher from Concordia University and the Canada Excellence Research Chair for Smart, Sustainable, and Resilient Cities, Matt Carlson, decarbonization lead from Arab, Edgar Lopez, Director of Engineering from Odette, Lafaf Azouz from Deloitte, Senior Manager of ESG and Decarbonization in Deloitte. So now I'll leave the floor for each of our panelists to give more of context of how their role in decarbonizing buildings within their teams and their companies or research institutes. And maybe let's get your perspective of what is the biggest challenge that you see to decarbonize our built environment. So I'll start with Ursula, and we can go around the table.
All right. Thank you, Mustafa, for the introduction and for the moderation of that panel. Well, as you know best, the team of mainly engineering students, but also some architects and urban planners that I've built over the last 3 years in the frame of this Canada Excellence Research Chair works to a large extent on decarbonization topics, not just of buildings, but also of transport, because that's the other big contributors, and trying to close loops in the waste streams. So it's because it's not just about carbon, it's also about resource use. I mean, one of the challenges is also resource use. So our team tries to look at urban decarbonization in a pretty comprehensive way. But my background is building physics, so I'm most close to the building sector and probably know most what is possible. And having spent most of my active life in Europe and Germany, especially, coming here was quite a change of culture, I would say. There's a lot of lots of not just experiments, but for sure pilot projects, and then sort of a start of rollout of zero carbon buildings going on in Germany and Europe. And I would even say the leads are probably more the Scandinavian countries. And coming here, I noticed that it's not enough to talk just about carbon, because here, especially here in Quebec, we have the privilege of having a decarbonized electricity system. So very often when I talk to real estate people, they say, well, it's pretty easy, we just switch fuels and then we're zero carbon, and which is true. So it's nothing wrong with that. And for sure it's one way to go, or it's probably the way to go to electrify the building energy supply. But of course, electricity is not infinite, and I think the debate is just starting in Quebec, that politicians on all levels, and not just Hydro-Quebec, are getting aware that even the sort of abundant Quebec is running out of renewable energy supply. So either it will be new dams, or it will be hopefully a much more diverse mix of renewables. But so we're talking, I think in this whole decarbonization debate, we're not just talking about simply moving to a zero carbon supply, renewable supply, but also providing enough renewable supply for all sectors. And if you take it into account transportation, which is the other third of a consumption of a city typically, we all know that there's not just enough clean fuels available today. So that's where we come back to the building sector and building efficiency. So I think my main take in this first round would be, it's not enough to switch fuels. We really need to tackle energy efficiency in the building sector. And as I said, when you see that many buildings here are still heated by baseboard heaters, direct heating, no heat pump use, it's a waste of the precious resource electricity. And I think we need to do a lot on this sort of energy system side to make the systems much more efficient, but also think of the building envelope, because it's always the cheapest option, at least to insulate your roofs and basements, and if the facades can be tackled, to do that as well. So I think it's a mixture of going for efficiency first, managing the energy then well, and of course providing the rest with renewables. And I guess on all levels there are barriers to it. It's expensive to retrofit envelopes, so I guess we will come back to all these topics of how to finance the transition. And thank you.
Thank you, Ursula. So,
as a passive house consultant, you're speaking my language for sure. I work for a company called Arup. We are a multidisciplinary engineering firm in the building and infrastructure space. So think one of the things that differentiates us is our commitment to advocating for sustainable practices in design. And there's a lot of ways to do that because we've got a lot of disciplines. But as one example, we have a couple of years ago committed to doing an LCA, a life cycle assessment, on every project that we do, every large project, whether or not that is something that the client is asking for or part of our scope. So we are building a database of embodied carbon and life cycle carbon of our projects with, you know, the purpose of benchmarking and, you know, eventually informing our decarbonization strategies, ways to reduce whole life carbon on our projects. You know, our involvement in C40 Cities and Ellen MacArthur Foundation, those kind of projects are, I think, sort of a sign of our commitment to sustainability. My own role at Arup is as decarbonization lead is in the energy and sustainability group. So we're sort of a collection of engineers doing various things, but it is mostly in the space of energy master planning, energy modeling for buildings or for portfolios, either for new construction to try to make efficient low carbon buildings, or in the retrofit space, which is really the complicated part of the sector. So you know, coming up with decarbonization strategies, roadmaps, you know, getting to net zero, whatever, over, you know, by some certain point, coordinated with, you know, a building's capital plan and the sort of budgets available to spend on them. So it's quite a, you know, that's really the difficult piece. The new construction piece is you know, almost sorted out, and there really is no pathway to a zero carbon future without going through all of our existing buildings, basically, and we've got a lot of them. That's, you know, even by 2050, the ones standing today are still going to be representing the bulk of our emissions if we don't do anything about them. So that's the gist of it, I guess. You know, we also touch on you know, master planning of things outside of buildings, airports, rail. We do certifications, passive house, as well as zero carbon building standard. Those are kind of our two faves, and I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Mustafa, for having us. I'm very happy to be here. And as you said, I'm the Senior Decarbonization Engineer at Audet. My background is been primarily in the energy efficiency space and built environment, approximately 15 years, bouncing around between demand side management for utilities, energy management for commercial real estate, as well as energy consulting, the more traditional energy audit, property condition assessment, energy modeling space. At Audet, how I see my role in the team that we have, how it fits into trying to solve the problem of decarbonizing the building stock, is identifying that there's a lot of building owners that want to do something, and often they don't know what to do. So they reach out to energy consulting companies, and this process is often slow. You go through a building the traditional style, collect a bunch of information about the building, take a lot of photos, go back to an office, put it all in a spreadsheet or an energy model, and then you provide the owner with a static snapshot of the building, so like a PDF. And so then this doesn't scale very well if you wanted to create a carbon reduction plan for every building. So this is what Audet is trying to do, create a carbon reduction plan for every building by using technology to leverage the impact of the energy consulting sector, and trying to bring the space of carbon retrofitting to scale. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Afaf. I'm Afaf Azuz. I'm a senior manager at Deloitte. I'll start with a bit of history of my career. I used to work very much on the engineering side prior to Deloitte, still do at Deloitte. But my background, I'm a building performance engineer. I specialize in everything energy efficiency, decarbonization of new construction and retrofit buildings. And I started my career as an energy modeling specialist in doing some of the things you guys have mentioned too. And so I think that gave me a very good insight into how complex building systems can be, how many people you have to talk to, because in Canada, they certified me as a building performance engineer just because they didn't know what specialty I'd be. So I guess we're in the right space here today because it's, we know about building engineering and it's a new up and coming kind of discipline, because you would have to be able to speak to an electrical engineer, a structural engineer about embodied carbon, electrical engineer about renewable energy, a mechanical engineer about all their HVAC systems, and obviously an architect about all the envelope considerations, and then be able to guide the entire team into a succinct, sustainable solution, and then convince them with the budget associated with the entirety of the project. So there's a lot of competing priorities in our field, and I know everyone sitting on this table and everyone sitting here as well knows about those. When I moved to, so in my engineering life prior to Deloitte, I was very much focused on a building scale. I worked with multiple public sector and private sector clients. But moving to Deloitte, I think was a really interesting career shift, in a sense that I'm now more focused on portfolio management, and I see the additional complexities that come with retrofitting, portfolios of companies, because oftentimes it's not just about a building. And where I came from a background where I thought buildings are the most important things, they have like 100 other things they need to prioritize. And sometimes buildings are only 5% of their entire greenhouse gas emission inventory. So it becomes, but at the same time, they are living in them, they're operating them. Sometimes they're leasing them, sometimes they're owning them. So needless to say, the multifaceted nature of this discipline has I guess, enlarged in my spectrum when looking at portfolios of companies that have aviation or fleets or cities to manage or whatever, right? Transport, investments even to manage, and suppliers, etc. I'd say one of the biggest challenges, just looping it back to your second question, is I would say awareness. I know everyone's talking, everyone knows what ESG is, kind of. It's such a big buzzword these days. Everyone knows about like climate change, and again, that's a buzzword. But I find that it's when they start saying, oh, let's do something about it, I find that half the time they're not really poking into the right fields. So they always just look at one aspect, like carbon, which again, Ursula talked about, is not the right approach. And yeah, let's stop here. So.
Thank you. I am very honored to be moderating this session after listening to all this introductions, and thank you for talking about your role, and also what are the obstacles or the opportunities that you see lying ahead, because that would be the topic of today's session, from electrification of the grid and the opportunity that lies ahead to it, or the slow adoption and scaling and using technology for that, or portfolio management and priorities that come for building decarbonization, and how awareness is important, and we need to walk the talk and not just talk the talk. So during the session, we're going to be going through different points, and each point I put like roughly 10 minutes for it. So I'm going to be suggesting like someone to start with discoursing like his idea, or saying his idea about it. And then if someone wants to add to that, feel free to it. So we're going to be starting by obstacles. I'll first want to talk about national energy building codes. So they play a crucial role in setting the standards of energy efficiency in buildings, and can have a major impact on decarbonization of the building sector. So, however, as we work to decarbonize the building sector, it's also important to talk about how effective these codes have been in promoting low carbon construction or transformation of current existing buildings and retrofits. And does the National Building Code that was recently released in 2020 with its tiered system, does it have a solution for this, or a breakthrough for this? So I will be starting with Afaf, if you can give us your insight about this.
Absolutely. I'm not going to single out the National Energy Code 2020, so I'll try and be as politically correct as possible. So I think codes are just catching up with the entire movement. So I think I would argue that a lot of the professionals, a lot of the companies are, and especially the specialists, like they're already like 4 or 5, a couple of years ahead than the codes. So I think the codes are catching up. But I'm a firm believer in the fact that codes are the only way, the stick or the carrot. I'm a firm believer that, the codes are actually one of the most effective ways to get people to change what they need to change. The tiered system is definitely helpful. So I think that is definitely a good start, but the codes are not comprehensive yet to include like things like climate risk, or designing around climate risk, or designing around embodied carbon, or designing around a just transition, or how you're addressing social aspects. But like I said, the codes are catching up. Also, the codes aren't 100% clear on what exactly you're doing for a retrofit building, since that's the scope of our discussion today. Codes are great for new construction, which are a tiny piece of our building stock. They're not so great when you're thinking about, other than a major retrofit, that's where a code could play a big role. But when you're thinking about building operators or managers or owners that have, I don't know, that are just retrofitting HVAC one step at a time, whenever it dies out, they change out the system. That is stuff that the code doesn't really cover as extensively. So it doesn't give them guidance on, okay, yeah, like I can just do a like for like replacement and no one's gonna tell me anything. But if it starts mandating things like, no, you cannot, and you have to have a stepped plan, or you have to submit something in advance of a replacement, even if it's minor, because that's the only way buildings are going to be retrofitted. No one has the capital to do like the major retrofits. So I might stop here and give some other people the chance to speak.
Would you want to tell us like some of the experiences in Europe about this, Ursula?
I guess it's pretty similar to. Okay, sorry, the wrong button. So I think it's pretty similar to what you said for here. I mean, I think there's always a certain fear of attacking retrofit, because that concerns everybody. And of course, politically, it's much more challenging of saying, well, when you've got a house, you bought it under certain premises, and now you need to retrofit it because the code does it. So no, it's exactly the same situation. There are some minimum standards, but they're really minimum. So there's no way as hard as the progressive building codes for new construction have been, that really go towards a very high efficiency, nearly passive standard building as far as the envelope is concerned, at least. So I think the situation is the same, and it's of course a problem of forcing every building owner, whatever the size is, to really improve the situation. And I think the one way cities are dealing with that, so if the code doesn't do it, of saying let's start monitoring consumption and making the consumption transparent, and then sort of putting caps on, predictable caps. I think that's probably important for the business side of things, that you know in advance this will come in a few years, and so you better prepare and plan your investments if you know your consumption needs to reduce by 2% every year, or citywide consumption needs to reduce. I think that's a good way to go, and where municipalities have some say and can do bylaws on trying to enforce consumption reduction. I think the key is really to make it predictable, and you can't change it from one day to the other. So it's because, as you said, there's a lot of money involved in these retrofits.
Yeah. And the initiative that I think Montreal is adopting and has been done in Europe, where you grade energy efficiency of buildings and make that public, that I think is important and will go a long way to, for lack of better word, shaming us into doing something, right? I mean, if it becomes public knowledge, and as we build new buildings closer and closer to net zero, the old building stock becomes more and more stranded if it's inefficient. The more inefficient it is, so you want you want to kind of keep up with that. It is very difficult to force building owners to, do retrofits that are outside of what they were going to do otherwise. There is an initiative with the NRC right now to come out with an alterations to existing buildings version of the NECB, the National Energy Code for Buildings. So that is being developed right now. We're, doing meetings every couple of weeks to discuss different elements, and it's complicated, right? I mean, as much as you want to simplify it, there are always cases where things get complicated, always. So, that's a difficult way to force things to happen, but it is necessary. But I think that it's probably not fast enough. By the time that the provinces and municipalities adopt, national codes, it's years down the road, and I think we all know that this decade is the most important. I mean, today is the most important, tomorrow is the next most important, and we can't really wait until 2050 to do all these things. So getting stuff done and figuring out how to do that, and I think ultimately it comes down to the price on carbon needing to be there, and I think we've started down that road. Who knows where the political winds will take us? If they take us in the wrong direction, it'll derail, all this effort that this industry has done to date, because that's really ultimately what justifies or makes a business case, and a business case is kind of what you need, and we're kind of accustomed in the industry to trying to promote long life cycle thinking. So, think about, a 50-year lifespan or more, and then these things start to make sense. But the reality is we actually don't have that much time anymore. So we need to try to think of, what can we do that makes sense in the next 10, 20 years? And it still has to make business sense for when we're talking about existing buildings, right? So that's where the price of carbon, I think, is key. That is going to fundamentally drive business decisions, whether it's today or just forecasting for tomorrow. You're not replacing like for like if it's burning natural gas, because in 10 years time, that's not going to make sense for your operating costs. And I think that's a big one, and that's really where your last point leads. Like, we can't do tens of thousands of buildings in the next decade or two. Like, we need to be doing thousands of buildings a day. We need a very scalable way to do that, to analyze that, to come up with solutions, because we're just like nibbling around the edges right now.
Yeah, I'm also a little bit of a code skeptic. It's sort of implicitly telling you the worst building you can build. And yeah, well, but without having a projection of future changes on a code, then you're, even if it's a progressive code that requires a certain minimum standard, that it's locking in that energy or the equipment that goes into the construction of that building for the life of that piece of equipment, say a boiler, 30 years. So even if the code was saying that you can only install condensing boilers, then you install that boiler and then that's there for 30 years. So things like a BC step code, when you're looking at performance standards, that you can look ahead so that real estate owners can do some long-term capital planning on what pieces of equipment can be replaced and when. And so with things like, say in BC in 2026, you can't install heating equipment that has a COP less than 1, then all of a sudden your like-for-like scenario changes, which can improve the metrics that you're going to be analyzing, say, a heat pump retrofit with. Yeah, so when it comes to codes, they need to either look forward or have alternative mechanisms for motivation, like I was saying, carbon taxes.
Perfect, thank you. Actually, that leads us to my second point to discuss about the different policy levels that we have, like between federal and provincial. And as you gave the example of the BC step code, and I wanted to propose like the question of like this the fragmented policy or the fragmented type of code development or adoption. Does it actually represent a barrier that we have like in in full-scale decarbonization or a national level decarbonization. If we're not talking about a certain province or a certain city, for speeding up this decarbonization efforts all over the country. So maybe we can start from where we ended, like, because I gave like the example of the BC step code as well.
Yeah, so it is sort of fragmented. There's very different rules in every province, and nationally with the carbon tax. I think it's currently at $50 or $65 a ton, and it's often reflected in the bills. They have a little section on the utility bill that's the portion of the carbon tax, and when that's going up, when you're doing say a future-looking analysis, when instead of using today's metrics like the cost of utilities today, the emissions intensity of today, rather look at the average emissions intensity as well as the average utility costs over the life of a project, then sort of suddenly the metrics start looking better. But in when it comes to individual provinces, some of the challenges I've seen speaking to real estate owners, they're aware that they need to retrofit their buildings, and so start doing some assessments. They're going out and getting ESCOs to do some energy audits and try to estimate how much it's going to cost to retrofit their buildings. And in some areas where you have a higher emissions intensity, the cost of the retrofit becomes higher. The metrics are not working out great in their favor, so they're looking to dispose of their properties in those areas. So that's sort of adding pressure to that particular province or region or municipality to try to bring up their standards so that they can continue to get investment.
So like my follow-up question would it be like more of like the role of developing, promoting like more restricting codes in very high polluting or high carbon intense grids or locations? What does it like make it more popular in these locations to adopt these codes or adopt higher tiers of the code that was developed? So
yeah, perhaps I can start. I'm not a policy expert, that's for sure, but I think it's very hard like to just say, can it ever not be fragmented? So I think it will always be fragmented, and we'll have to work within the challenges of the fragmentation, unfortunately. Similar to what you were saying, like, yes, that's where people try to divest, but also it's where people try to put their money to do renewable energy projects right now. So the amount of investment that's going into Alberta and all the polluting provinces with regards to RECs, like renewable energy certificates, or virtual power purchase agreements, which are a more robust way of investing into renewable energy projects, is also massive. Because as a consequence, yes, maybe maybe Alberta was like one of not the first one to adopt a national energy code, or when they adopted, they didn't adopt the latest version, and then like Ontario maybe was faster or BC was faster, but eventually they've all adopted it. And yes, it is potentially the worst building you can build, but it's forcing people to start to think about these considerations, even if you're working with a very dirty electricity grid. And so you have to work with your constraints, and I find that there are overarching fundamentals of how to retrofit a building or how to build a building that should be, yes, ideally standardized, because there's an abatement hierarchy. It goes from load reduction, like reduce whatever you're doing first, and then passive strategies like envelope, all the reductions that costs zero money in terms of like your building actually sheltering from you needing to heat or cool, and then the active strategies, and then only at the very bottom you start thinking about renewable energy, and very, very bottom about offsets, if at all. So I would say that is there in all the provinces, although it's not being implemented the right way. But also at the same time, the flip side is, yes, there is, as a consequence of it being so dirty, there is a lot more investment in those specific, outside of the policy, I'd say there's a lot more investment in those specific provinces because they have to catch up faster. So that these projects might actually help you know, increased awareness around, okay, what can you do in different kinds of grid electricity, grid carbon intensities.
There's an unintended maybe benefit to having it fragmented, which is that, you know, certain municipalities or provinces who have decided that they want to do better become the, you know, they're not shackled by whatever the national code says. They're just doing their own thing. And so, you know, Vancouver and BC and the city of Toronto and Montreal have been sort of leading the way with STEP code and Toronto Green Standard and the new programs being rolled out in this city. So that is something you might not see otherwise, I think, if it wasn't, you know, fragmented in that way. So I think those provinces and those municipalities are becoming maybe leaders that the other provinces want to emulate, or at least hopefully. It all sort of comes down to politics ultimately. So you never know which way it's going to go. But in Ontario, we have very unfortunately just had Bill C-23 pass through, which sort of takes away municipalities' ability to have their own special energy code, right? Like the Toronto Green Standard, for example, which has been very effective, I think. New construction only, of course, at least for now. There are plans for rolling out a retrofit program. It's just not that easy, and COVID sort of derailed that progress. But so that's, you know, that's very unfortunate news, but that's not happening here anyway, which is nice.
Actually, the idea of competition between municipalities or provinces for developing higher building codes, that actually sounds very promising. And I hope, yeah, like especially in Montreal, the recent regulation of new construction from 2025, I believe, will all have to be zero carbon emissions. And I'm not sure like if it was operational carbon or embodied carbon as well. But I totally agree about the competition. The fragmented policy has like maybe two sides of benefit, pros and cons. So the pros are the high competition. I think mostly for investments that would like risk-free regarding carbon emissions would be able to move towards places or locations that have adopted higher standards for carbon emissions or lowering carbon emissions. So I totally agree.
Maybe just to add, I mean, I think we already discussed that the code is basically the minimum. So of course, if everybody would need to agree, it would be even more minimum. So I think that is pretty obvious. I think we need to talk more about the front runners and the ones who really want to lead in the effort to decarbonize. And I think there's a much broader picture to look at in access to finance, for example. I mean, I think yesterday I heard a podcast that there's only 1,000 companies.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, sorry. Someone switches color. Sometimes it's green when it's mute. Anyway, so what I was saying, I mean, I think it's time to look more for the front runners and what the incentives are. And I think there's especially from the financial markets, there's increasing opportunities for companies who do pretty aggressive decarbonization strategies with much easier access to capital. And I mean, I'm not a specialist in that topic, but I've found it pretty convincing to hear that there's only a very limited number of companies. I think the number was 1,600 or so that have a zero carbon strategy. They find it so much easier to get access to capital. I think this will probably, hopefully, exert a much bigger pull of the market of saying if you are amongst the first to fully decarbonize, you get better access to impact investors and all kinds of investment budgets that allow you to create these projects that we're all waiting for. Because I think one of the problems is there's a lot of talk about decarbonization, but truly ambitious projects which are highly energy efficient, are renewably supplied, I don't see many of them. I mean, I don't see much solar in Montreal. It has more irradiance than Stuttgart, than Germany, but I haven't really seen much solar projects here. And I mean, Quebec, of course, is a different system. It's not even, it doesn't have the carbon pricing, so it's a very different system. But as a result, carbon is not very expensive here. So I think it's probably time that we talk about more the incentives, or how can companies sort of move ahead without, because the code, I totally agree, will catch up, but will probably not be the leader in sort of bringing the change fast enough.
Yeah, thank you. I actually, that would lead us like to the point of the slow adoption that we have, like maybe like understood through the lines here, through the last discussions. And I would like to discuss like the problem of slow adoption from two aspects, from maybe the policy side through the accelerator initiative that Ursula has initiated, and also from the technical side that Edgar has mentioned in the beginning of his presentation and beginning of introduction, about the technical side of how slow developing sustainable transitions for multiple buildings or on scale is actually a problem, and we're not able to adopt sustainable transitions very quickly because of this this technical problem, or like data problem. So first, maybe if you can tell us more about the accelerator initiative, and then we go to the technical side.
Yeah, I mean, Montreal, as many cities, has a 2030 plan to decarbonize. I mean, one initiative was this zero emission regulation for new build. But in the end, especially talking about retrofit, we analyzed the situation and saw that there's not many projects happening that fulfill the sort of targets that we are thinking about. So, and then the question is, what are the barriers? Why do projects not get built as to such high efficiency standards than we would like to see? And there's, of course, multiple barriers. It's financial barriers, access to capital that I mentioned before. There might be legal issues, there might be technical problems, or limited capacity to know what are the best systems in a given situation, and so on. So we identified a bunch of barriers, and in the end said, why don't we get people together who can make decisions in each of these sectors, whether it's from the municipal side, like faster zoning or permitting processes, maybe bonus density, bonus heights, whatever makes a project financially more viable. The finance sector, of course, to provide these sort of loans that get better conditions the more sustainable a project is. Energy consultants, researchers, and so on. So we sort of founded this team of decision makers, let's say, and say, we are ready to support projects in the sense of analyzing project and suggesting improvements on the sustainability side, and then supporting the process of making it happen. So I think that's basically an attempt more on the process side of saying, let's bring all these people together that you need to get a project moving forward faster, and providing the necessary finance. And for us, it was a bit of an exercise to, first of all, define the criteria, what makes a project better. It's a very sort of vague term. Of course, you could say I use certification systems, but there's many, and which one is the right one? What do you take into account? Is it just the buildings? No, it's of course also the public spaces, the way a project deals with mobility, and so on. So I think what we try to do is we set up this team of decision makers. We started an extensive discussion on indicators, which is not trivial. And we're looking now at the first project of a private developer that we try to support on improving the sustainability and, of course, the carbon emissions of that project. And we hope to, I mean, the first project is always the hardest because you need all this debate on amongst very different stakeholders of what do we think is a good project. But we hope to do that every couple of months to look at a new project. And then, of course, there needs to be many teams like that to scale up. It's just, I would say, more an attempt of process of saying, how can we make it happen? Because I think one of the issues is that it's this whole setting up project needs so many stakeholders, and it takes a lot of time and thus money. So if we could speed up this process, get the people who all look at a project from the different angles together, maybe it speeds it up, saves money, and this saved money could be invested in higher building efficiency or a lower carbon project. So that's the idea.
So I'll move from speeding up the stakeholder analysis to speeding up the building analysis. So Edgar, like at ODAT, how do you overcome this the heterogeneous typology of buildings and developing like more of an accelerated method to just provide a transition plan for each building on scale?
Yeah, so in working with the real estate sector, doing discovery, in doing our legacy work a more manual way, we discovered that even Class A buildings don't have very good data. So there's that problem with data, but there is a lot of information, whether it's public, private, that exists. It's a problem of aggregating all this data. So what happens when a building wants a retrofit plan, and then go through a traditional process? Could be a couple of weeks, could be a couple of months till they get a report. There's a sense that the workforce that exists in the consulting industry, it's just, there's not enough. And even if you accelerate the training and number of people to do this exercise, you can't get enough of them. And then once you receive that that information on these are the things that we're going to do, there's the choosing of which ones of these projects are we going to implement. So the idea of doing a carbon reduction plan rather than an energy audit is to prioritize. So we optimize, we use data aggregation, some simplified energy modeling based on what we know about your building. And then we present you with a carbon reduction plan. And then we tell you, is this estimate okay? So we're flipping it to them. Instead of them waiting, we tell you, this is what we think your building looks like. Confirm or add to what our assumptions are. So it's like a preloaded energy model. And we're also using techniques like machine learning to identify rooftop equipment to further narrow or increase the confidence of our assumptions. So what potentially is in your building, as well as using archetypal information, regional energy use intensities, so that we can get a better estimate. And so with that engagement, the more people that go through the process of giving us additional information like the utility data for calibration or the full equipment list to fully refine the model, it creates a flywheel effect so that our overall analysis, it gets better over time. So that's how we're planning to accelerate the creation of carbon reduction plans.
If I understand correctly, it's mainly for the preliminary stage of a retrofit, and then like it goes like into more of a deep analysis later on, if we're talking on like analyzing on different stages of installing equipment, or even on the lifetime of the building, or even a higher level model.
Yeah, right? So with what you were mentioning about the number of stakeholders that need to be involved, there is a lot of options and restrictions that exist. Things that we look into, like projections for the decarbonization of a particular grid, potential legislation that may exist that might improve performance, as well as things like potentially inflation or decreasing cost of certain retrofits. So when you look at all the different variables that exist in creating a carbon reduction plan, and of course the sequencing, and we try to adopt a resource efficient electrification where we go by reducing loads and then finally replace with a right side heat pump, in speaking of the heating in general. But what we're doing is trying to optimize that sequence, but by also including things like the life of the equipment. So why not install a heat pump now? If the boiler might not be near the end of its useful life, but preemptively analyze what the load reduction would be. The envelope reduction, that's far down the road. My windows are relatively new. My roof is relatively new, so I might look into doing heat recovery later as well as the envelope. So if I do those things in the future, what size of my heat pump needs to be now, and then you can keep your legacy system as backup. So looking into all the different combinations that exist and giving the user the ability to do scenario planning. Like, well, what if the carbon tax increases? And then they're able to do that. Or what if build performance standards increase? What if I have a carbon reduction target? What is the most optimal way in which I can do this? So that's what we're doing.
Okay, it sounds super interesting. And I don't know, at the beginning, at the entry of the hall, there was this table, there is still this table with the digital model of Montreal in that case. But in a way, we're trying to build also tools that automate the process. Of saying we know a lot of stuff. We know the geometry, of course, of the city. We have archetype information, and so it would be really interesting to exchange on the details, because in the end, if we could, that's what we're trying to do. You click on a building in that digital model and you get 2 retrofit scenarios. So, and probably you could get hundreds. Mustafa is working on also trying to deal with these sort of infinite combinations of in time and what measures you take. But it would be really interesting to have a more later, maybe not in this panel, but have a more technical debate on how could we advance this tool building and make it easily accessible. To then, of course, this only can be a sort of first shot. Yep. And then at some point, some person or somebody, a company needs to come in and talk, make an offer and do the works. But it would be really interesting to talk about the methods.
Yeah, that sounds very interesting. I think we have a lot to talk about after the panel even. So I would like to ask also Afaf about you work mainly with portfolios. So you have mostly a lot of buildings for one stakeholder. So how does it give more an easier decision making towards transitioning or lowering the carbon emissions from a building?
I would argue it doesn't
Okay.
give an easier. Yes, you're right. You're working with one company at a time. But like I said, oftentimes they're looking at their entire portfolio. That's not just buildings. So assuming it's a real estate developer where buildings is the key driver, obviously that's where they will put most of their money. If it's any other type of company, then the focus might be less. So scenario B, where the focus might be less on buildings, I find that they go about it occasionally the wrong way, where they're like, oh yeah, envelope's too expensive. I don't know what is too expensive. This equipment is not at the end of their life. I'm a cynic, but we will talk about opportunities later. And then they're like, okay, but you know what? RECs or renewable energy certificates are actually quite cheap today, and they're going to get more expensive. So how about we just offset that 5% of our entire portfolio of emissions with RECs? And then which is exactly the wrong way of going about it. For a case where buildings are contributing a much, much higher portion of their greenhouse gas emissions, what we see is, okay, but sometimes they don't own all the buildings. Sometimes there's tenants inside that have various ownership models. They don't have the right access to capital, or still there's multiple approval processes. And so I would argue though that if most of the companies we work with, be them private or public, are actually in a phase right now where someone was saying the codes are actually going to be the front runners, the leaders, the incentivizers, the investors. Actually, these are the people that are going to push people faster. So, and that's where I see most of the pressure coming from, and that's where the faster adoption will come. And so for those, most of the companies are oh my God, my investor is asking me, what am I doing? They're a fund manager where they, build a lot of new buildings or retrofit a lot of new buildings, retrofit a lot of buildings, or buy property and sell it at a different time or operate the property. It doesn't matter what they do, but oftentimes there are different ownership and operational schemes in play. But they're like, yeah, someone's up there has asked me what I'm doing about ESG, what I'm doing about climate, and then they're like, okay, but also what are my peers doing? And so that's another pressure piece that advances a bit the slower adoption and makes it a bit of an opportunity. And then there are occasional people, so I'm maybe talking about the ecosystem of people that are pressuring companies to have a bit of a faster adoption rate. So it would be investors, obviously regulation, but it comes a bit slower, although it is coming for public companies. There is now a TCFD framework, like a task force on climate-related financial disclosures, that is forcing all companies to link their climate strategy with their financial strategy to show how they are combating climate and how much climate change is impacting their financials, their value. So all of a sudden, there's now this idea of, oh my God, if I don't do anything about climate, I'm actually in trouble. All goes to say that is it easier to deal with one stakeholder at a time? Yes, because now the adoption rate is becoming faster because they have these pressures left and right, and they have one mandate of saying, I have to decarbonize my operations and have to be net zero by 2050, but I also have to be almost 50% reduced by 2030, which is 8 years from now, or 7 years now from now, which means they have to start now. In portfolio life, sometimes the abatement hierarchy that I was talking about won't take place. So you'll have to be a bit forgiving in when and how they retrofit, but it will happen because of all the pressures that I mentioned.
Yeah, thank you. And Matt, do you want to add to?
I was going to say, related to the TCFD topic, which is, I think, is a very important one, sort of the top-down forcing of assets to decarbonize. I guess it only touches on specific sector, but nonetheless important because they're usually the biggest buildings. But is the Investor Confidence Project, which is something that is just beginning to get popular here. I think it's more popular in other jurisdictions, I think maybe in New York and in Europe, but it essentially is kind of a way to entice private capital to come into this retrofit market. So it's a way of kind of standardizing the retrofit strategy packages for different buildings, but they don't have to be part of the same portfolio. They can be disparate portfolios, it can be one-offs, it can be whatever you want, but it's an analysis that's done in a standardized way, and you basically get a report, and here's the financials of it. And maybe you're not, maybe a fund isn't interested in investing like $5 million in a project, but maybe they are interested in investing $100 million in all of these projects because the risks go down. The risk on an individual project of the energy going any which way is much higher than if you've got a large set of buildings, and on average they're probably going to behave the way that's being predicted. There will be ones that are outside of the range, but on average you're going to probably get the returns you're expecting. And so yeah, I'll invest in these whatever it is, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 buildings. That's I think a similar kind of strategy, but a sort of top-down strategy that I think would be wise to adopt a little more. Canada Infrastructure Bank has started paying attention to that and done a couple of projects that way. I think it's very smart. It'd be nice to see more of that.
Perfect. I think the most heard word during the last hour was investor, financial, and so on. So it leads me to the last obstacle that I would like to discuss is actually the financial mechanisms that we have currently available and the options available for investors. Are they enough, or there's other means or other solutions to incentivize? And I would start with Ursula, because you mentioned the financial.
Is it enough? It's a difficult question. And I don't think it's enough because it's not happening at the rate we want it to happen. So I'm also not so convinced that it's just a question of budget, of money. I mean, of course, the finances need to be accessible, but I think there's also a more fundamental problem of where do we want to go with the retrofits. And as I said, if I compare the building performance here with what is now more or less standard in Europe, I think we're still quite lagging behind. And this, despite being a much harsher climate. So I'm really a bit shocked in a way at how new construction still looks like here, and what, I mean, sometimes you don't even know what your energy consumption is because you don't pay for it. It's included in the rent, so so there are financial aspects to it, so that the tenants are not even aware of what they're consuming because they never see it, especially here in these new condos that pop up everywhere. I mean, if they're for rent. But I also have the impression, I mean, there's sort of legacy ways of doing things in North America, all air-based distribution. I mean, you hardly see that in Europe. It's just the air, it's just the fresh air supply, and that has heat recovery in buildings. So the passive standard is very clear about that. And I don't see, I haven't even seen sort of excellently insulated envelopes with triple glazing, and basically very airtight construction, ventilation with heat recovery. I mean, it's pretty obvious what we need to do, but I haven't really seen it in many buildings because I guess the history or the tradition of how to do HVAC here has evolved in a certain way that where efficiency was never at the forefront. So I think in addition to providing the money, I think we also need to talk a bit about the capacity and the technical training and what sort of your standard HVAC engineer knows and knows how to do. I think that to me, I mean, until we see that at these front runner or the best practice projects popping up to a much higher number, where you can actually take people to and say, well, this is a exemplary building that fulfills the efficiency standards that we want to see. I mean, both new and in retrofit. I mean, you can retrofit also to passive standard building. I think then I think in a way, the financing part will be solvable because all these projects at least over the lifetime, they pay back. They might have long amortization times, but they will pay back eventually. So I think the financing can be organized, but I think we should talk a bit about where do we see the building stock evolve to? I mean, what kind of efficiency standard is really possible and doable, and what are the best projects you've ever done? I would be really interested to see that, because certainly I don't know if I have visitors from Europe. I don't know a building in Montreal where I say, okay, that's where we go to. This is a sort of zero emission, passive standard, whatever, school. Or I'm not aware, at least. So I think we still need that. We need these projects that show how it could be done.
Yeah, I think once there's a critical mass of high performance buildings, then you've got other elements that sell them. So I mean, this is sort of the passive house sales pitch in a way. Like once you've been in one, you don't want to, live in a regular code built house. And I think that'll be true for commercial buildings as well. I mean, you don't want to spend your entire day in a building that's not very comfortable. And if you've got the option, or if you have the experience of working in a comfortable building, living in a comfortable building, I mean, much more comfortable than we're used to, especially on the harshest days. We've got, as you say, much harsher weather here, winter and summer, than continental Europe. Then you won't want to go back, and that'll slowly push everybody to want to do that. I mean, if all of a sudden your downtown Class A building becomes kind of a Class B building, you're going to want to retrofit that just to keep up with the Joneses. to maintain your tenants, and the same applies to residential buildings. I hope. I mean, energy cost is really, I think, the fundamental thing there. The difference between what we do and what they do in Europe is because energy is cheap here and we take it for granted. And we complain when the price goes up, but it's, much, much more expensive in Europe. And so these things are a given. You're going to build efficiently.
I will go to Afaf about the pressures that you mentioned, and one of them is the financial pressures. And do you think that this would just like speed up the process of transitioning? Because personally, like when I was in like last November in COP27, I sensed that during the sessions that I attended, the financial incentives and the financial mechanisms are the one that can sometimes for bigger scale to increase the speed. Do you think that? Or
Yeah, so I was writing down like all the key stakeholders and some of these financial institutions, like who incentivizes today some of that faster adoption. And so like banks themselves on a corporate level already have, most of the big banks already have like net zero targets for themselves, which involve their investments. So their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, and their scope 3 emissions is like, where are you going to invest? And if you're going to invest and give money to someone, that is critical. They're always now looking for the selection criteria. What does it make? What makes a project good? What makes it financeable? How do we make sure? And climate is like a small piece out of 100 other things, but that is going to happen. And like you mentioned, like Canada Infrastructure Bank is already paying a lot of attention there, and they're financing real estate developers in the hundreds of millions of dollars to start retrofitting hundreds of buildings at a chunk. They also have selection criteria associated with that. I think the big piece is like, what is the standardized selection criteria for financing projects? Obviously, governments, they have left and right incentives when it comes to either like indigenous relationships promotion, but they have like climate strategy promotion, things like that. So they have, again, that multifaceted promotion of like larger scale projects. And then you go again back to the utilities and how like utilities incentivize like the small homeowners, like a few with the demand response programs, or with the, doing an energy audit for free for you, and then helping you a little bit think about the life cycle of your home. So I think there are multiple tiers of intervention that are happening right now. But I personally know a company that goes up to private companies and actually says, hey, like if you have a portfolio of, it doesn't matter actually, they do it on a project basis or they do it on a portfolio basis, and they really say, hey, we're in the business of writing checks to people that want to decarbonize and find energy efficiency solutions, and that's their entire mandate. And then it's the concept of a kind of like an ESCO framework, right? Energy service contracts, and lots of people are in that business too. Still, it's an older business, but it's coming back in revolutionized ways and methods. So it's like, okay, we'll take back like the cost of the energy savings, and then. Very last point on like the private companies, when they're going to their boards for approval on like, hey, this is a climate strategy, either way, we're going to have to address these 4 or 5 pillars of changes, because we might have an upgrade to a building, or we own a stadium, or we own whatever, and this project has to happen. But here, this is the 5% premium that you'll need to put if you want to decarbonize, and here, this is the operational savings. So oftentimes investors are willing to put that extra 5% because they're already putting hundreds of millions of dollars in that. So they will, most of the time, they will get that approval from the board, provided there's not other competing priorities. But yeah.
thank you.
An interesting experience from my time in commercial real estate as an energy manager. I was in a property management company, and we managed properties for a number of different building owners. And this particular building owner was really all for sustainability. So we developed a few zero carbon warehouses with this owner. But this owner, as I understood, was not always looking to create sustainable infrastructure. So a lot of building owners tend to be pension fund holders, and they compete for additional investments. And how we've been doing that recently is through GRESB, the Global Real Estate Sustainability Board, I think it is. And so, you know, they tend to put a chunk of their money in real estate because it's generally a safe investment and it has a decent return. But now with climate change pressures, they start ranking them through GRESB. And so when this particular pension fund lost investment to another pension fund on the basis of not having enough building certifications or performance standards, that's when it changed for them. So the financial markets are catching up, and I think we're coming to an inflection point. I think there's an estimate around the cost of retrofitting all existing buildings is in the range of $10 trillion. It's an insane amount of movement of capital that will create a lot of economic activity, and it's going to happen fast. So I think it's coming. Well, I hope it's coming.
Sure, I hope so. I totally agree also that having this different standards like in different buildings would rank those buildings and increase the value also. So it doesn't have just the payback period of the lower like the lower energy costs or the lower operation costs, but it also has the value increase of the building or the asset itself. And that leads us to maybe talk about opportunities here. So I wanted to discuss about the opportunity of the movement towards electrifying all buildings. And does it, for the case of Quebec, for example, does just switching to the fuel type, that will be the only thing that we will do for decarbonizing, or we should like have more proper talk about like we need like to decrease our demand to accommodate more buildings for this transition? So I'll start with Ursula, because you mentioned that in your
Yeah, that's how I started the discussion. I mean, yeah, I think electrification is, of course, key because there are not that many renewable alternatives. I mean, there will be for sure some contribution of biomass-based or hydrogen-based fuels in future, but I mean, I don't know exactly the numbers here, but I mean, in Europe is usually in the order of 10%, in Germany, sort of in highly dense populated countries. I guess here it could be a bit higher. Maybe we could be talking about 20% or so, or maybe even 30, but it's definitely in the minority. So what the biofuels could contribute, and they're also needed for other sectors like aviation or industrial, harder to abate sectors like in industrial production. So I think electrification is key, but as I said, there's not enough renewable resources available. I mean, here in Quebec, it's now 45% is electric, very clean, but 55% are missing. So either we build all this, I mean, we need to build extra capacity, but it would be, of course, not the right way just to continue as we're doing just now and build all that capacity, because it also requires tons of resources that might become an additional challenge. So it's, of course, much more intelligent to also think of demand reduction. And I think demand reduction, especially in the building sector, is pretty easy because we know how to do it. I don't think it's a technical problem. I mean, we have the strategies. It needs to be done. It needs to be financed. We need to have trained people to do it physically. But I think the path is pretty clear. So that should definitely be always the first step to reduce the demand and then move towards renewable supply. But yeah, I think to a large extent it will be electric in future.
Yeah, I agree. It is not that simple. We definitely need to reduce demand, but to make it even more complicated, we also need to think about the life cycle carbon of the project if it's a retrofit. So if we had all the time in the world, you could do whatever you wanted, but if you're going to replace a pretty good envelope with, say, a brand new envelope that's high performance, you need to think about the materials that are going into it, because if you emit a ton, not a literal ton of emissions producing that envelope and installing it, and it's going to take you 150 years to pay it off in your carbon savings from switching fuels, then it's arguably not worth it. And then there are all kinds of material options. There's lots of research out there on what kind of low carbon materials you can use for building envelope retrofits, but it's difficult with big buildings because you're sort of limited to curtain wall systems, for example. It's much easier if you're dealing with houses and you can use natural materials for insulation. But I think that is an important piece of this puzzle that is, it makes a hard problem harder, unfortunately, but it is the same problem and we can't ignore it. So we can't be penalizing ourselves today and sort of pushing up the emissions that are in the atmosphere to a level that definitely makes us not able to hit net zero by 2050. So it's hard to think about this stuff when emissions are invisible and free and they just go up in the air and sort of blow away. But now we know the consequences of that, and we sort of can't ignore it. A brand new triple glazed curtain wall system or something that is maybe produced in Eastern Europe, or who knows, maybe China, or maybe assembled in various places. It's got a long path around the globe, and when it finally gets installed here, it could be a century-long payback in terms of carbon. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't be building high performance, because we definitely should, but in terms of retrofits, it makes it even more complicated.
Can I add to this? Because I maybe a year ago I read this beautiful article saying, oh yeah, there's all these claims around being net zero operational, but actually all our buildings are wrapped in fossil fuel, which I thought it was a really good embodiment or visualization of what we're doing to our buildings. And granted, all the buildings that are already built, they already have that embodied building stored. So it's it's best not to mess too much with it, but obviously you should look for natural, recycled, reclaimed, bio-based types of materials. And the construction industry is trying very hard to move in that direction. The steel industry is looking very much into some of these solutions. Concrete and cement is a huge player. So there's all these different kinds of companies left and right that are actually looking at absorbing carbon. So not just electrification, moving steel from combustible furnaces to electric air furnaces. No, but actually absorbing carbon in the process. And so I'm sure everyone's familiar with that. I'm going to try to, so that's why I wanted to turn it a little bit more into an opportunity, because there is movement into that. But electrification, I was sitting with a power engineer in a meeting with a client a couple of years ago, and we were oh yeah, you need to electrify, that is the solution. And then he's after that he called me, he's Afaf, what are you doing? You're just giving short-term solutions, and the utilities aren't going to match up very soon. So you need to, obviously, I think where everyone here is clear is that you have to respect the abatement hierarchy. I'm not going to repeat it again. But fundamentally, and unfortunately, no one here in this room today, including myself, is willing to actually reduce. I'm not willing to close my home living in a suburb and go live somewhere in an earth ship or something like that. Fundamentally, no one's willing to actually go back. Fundamentally, if you're talking about private or public companies, they care about growth and expansion, and that is a fundamental need for profit, but no one's actually willing to reduce drastically. We're always just looking for alternatives and solutions to, how do we make ourselves feel better about what we're doing while continuing to grow? Because that is the reality. We're always going to grow. So I think what might happen in the short term is, yes, people are going to electrify, and then the utilities are going to cap out, and then they're going to, which they're already doing, and they're already offering these incentives left and right on how to reduce demand. And Ontario has this global adjustment rate on if you are one of the highest contributors in the coldest or the hottest summer or winter days, then you pay a lot more than your average person next door who had a better demand response plan. But fundamentally, I think that's what the shift's going to happen. People are going to electrify first, and then they're going to be oh no, this is not going to continue, because the utilities are going to keep rising. And there's social implications with building more dams, obviously, especially in Quebec and everywhere. But then what people are going to do is they're going to look into diversifying the electricity grid and growing that slowly while reducing their demand. I think that's probably where it's going to go.
Would you like that?
Yeah, with respect to, excuse me, electrification. Yeah, I think it needs to be done, but it matters how it's done. I spoke earlier about resource efficient electrification. So you have to look at the limitations of the building, the service, the electrical service that the building has, because you can't just, grab your boiler and put in an electric boiler. And might work in some, excuse me, in some places, but for the most part, it's not a simple plug and play. So you need to look at a collection of measures that are going to help. So things that reduce your load, like load shifting measures, as well as LED measures, things that will reduce your electrical load so that you have more room for a new electrical demand in the winter that was previously gas, but also reducing the load so that the heat pump can be right size. So you don't replace 1,000 MVH of boiler with 1,000 MVH of heat pump. It doesn't make financial sense. But a very important thing that's going to drive the implementation of retrofits like heat pumps is the cost of electricity and how it relates to the cost of the alternatives, gas. So if the ratio of the cost of electricity over the cost of gas is similar or greater to that the COP of a heat pump, then you're breaking even at best, or actually not saving anything. So it will be a no payback measure. So mechanisms like carbon pricing, leveling up, incentivizing the use of one fuel over the other.
Yeah, I totally agree on that. And since we're almost like due time, I would leave like some time for our audience if they have questions. So is there any questions out here? Also on the Zoom. So we have a question here.
Hi, thank you. I'd love to hear the panel about zoning barriers and maybe because some municipalities have started to remove barriers to zoning, decarbonizing buildings. There's been huge efforts in that sense, in that direction in New York, for example, and Vancouver. So I'd just like to hear the panel on this matter. Thank you.
Not sure if we have like that enough time, but like I guess who would like to
well, yeah, I mean, I can give it a try. I mean, I think the relation is, I would say, is probably a bit more indirect. I mean, what I've seen happening here in negotiations with developers, that zoning can be used to make a project more financially viable. For example, to higher density or high. Here the discussions are always about building height. So in a way, I mean, that's of course municipal power, and they can use it to increase the demand on building more sustainably. So by giving this bonus density, or by, yeah, let's stick with this, they would get from the developer in return more social housing units, more higher building standards, and whatever they request. So I think it's more an instrument to trade. I mean, to basically to say, I give you extra. Zoning allows to do this sort of trading, and mostly, as I said, it's about either the mixity of use, so changing usage, or increasing building heights that can be used to support these more sustainable projects. And then, of course, zoning is crucial, I would say, more for the mobility question. In the end, I mean, the building envelope is not affected by a zoning restriction, but zoning, of course, creates a density, and mixity of use creates a density and mixed use that makes it possible that people don't need a private car. So I think the zoning is a super important instrument to guarantee that public transit becomes viable in a development. And as I said, I think it could be, if intelligently used, it could be used to bring forward these sort of ambitious projects that we want to see.
Thank you, Ursula. Do we have other questions in Zoom?
Yeah, maybe I'll just jump to Zoom really quickly. Well, first, Philippe was a general contractor specializing in retrofits, was inviting people to get in touch if they're interested. And I'll move on to Hugo Lafrance, who says, who asks, I should say, what place do you foresee for PV on buildings in the province of Quebec for transitioning to zero carbon buildings?
I can maybe start with that. Hi, Hugo. I know him. I would say primarily industrial buildings, because they're one of the harder buildings to abate for sure, and they have lots of roof space. Granted, some of that roof space could be filled with a whole bunch of HVAC equipment, but likely that is a good place to start, especially in Quebec. I know we were talking to some developers that have multiple industrial buildings, and they were looking into that as a viable solution, but also to sell the electricity back, or to start doing sustainable bonds associated with these projects. So there's multiple, if they're not using them internally for their own offset of the energy inside the industrial facility, it could also to sell it back or to make a sustainable bond out of it. So maybe.
Project done by Silence, I think their flagship store in Quebec City or near Quebec City, where they covered their parking lot in sort of PV canopy, which is something that I think could work really anywhere in Canada. It would be great to see a lot of, because otherwise we've just got paved surfaces that are, almost a waste. It's almost a shame, right? And there's lots of benefits you could have by having PV canopies, not just the generation, but shading the cars even.
To that effect, I remember reading recently that I think in Paris or somewhere in France, there's a new law in effect that requires PV canopies over parking lots of a certain number of parking spaces.
Yeah, perfect. Okay. One last question. Thank you, Naveed.
Yeah, I have a question about electricity tariff in Quebec. So what do you think about that? Because right now in all around Canada, Quebec has cheapest electricity. Do you think this tariff can have positive impacts on the building decarbonization, or it has negative impact? At the moment, we have a debate in Quebec that they want to even bring it down more, and they want to send electricity to other countries like US. And do you think that has, personally, do you think that has a negative impact or positive impact on the final decarbonization building?
So we have,
and also the dynamic pricing, how do you think, if they go through a dynamic pricing?
so we have 2 minutes actually. So who would?
I can start. I would say, I know there was such a big debate in Ontario a couple of years ago around real estate property prices, rental increasing. I'm sure that's the same case for Vancouver. And then also complaining about people can't afford their utility bills. Versus here, I think we have, like you said, one of the cheapest utility rates. Thank you, Hydro-Quebec. So I definitely think it is a motivator, and I personally think it's a good thing to make, it's like affordability of housing, and utilities are a big chunk of that on the operational life cycle. So I think it's important to have that for sure. It's a question of resilience. So I hope Hydro-Quebec is sitting and doing their own calculations on matching demand and capping at a certain time, because how will they sustain the future of everyone fastly adopting electricity in this province? So that's the only thing, but I'm a big supporter of it.
Okay, perfect. The last comment.
I do agree that having a low electricity cost is on its own form of incentive to switch fuels. So yeah.
Yeah, and think finally, and time of use will need to come in
Yeah.
to regulate for the peaks. And
Exactly.
and of course, I mean, they will need to build new capacity. There's no way around it. I mean, we won't save 50% of the current electricity consumption, and that new built electricity will probably be, I mean, most likely be more expensive than the heritage electricity. So, and then there's a question again, how do you mix that into the tariff structure? And probably a time of use price will be the easier way to go than just raising a fixed tariff for everybody.
I think that's something that is probably that we're going to see in the next few years. But closing off this very interesting session, we learned a lot about the obstacles and opportunities that lie ahead in the built environment sector in order to decarbonize. I surely want to thank all my panelists and your thoughts, your time, and accepting to speak today. I'm very honored with that. I want to thank the audience over Zoom and in person today, and I thank you for your questions and for your attendance today. I also want to thank the Public Scholar Program and the Next Generation Cities Institute for all the support from my colleagues for this. And surely this is only a step of discussing the issues, but we have a long way to decarbonize our communities and built environment. So I hope you enjoyed the discussion and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.